Good morning, and thank you for finding time to be with us. The show is Good Morning Africa. My name is Miriam Ogutu, and I trust that your day has started off well. It is the 21st of September 2022. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuned in and watching us from. I'll get into the headlines, and then I'll bring you the latest news from across the continent of Africa. We'll start with the leading newspapers here. From Kenya, the Star newspaper, headache for Ruto as MPs ask for more money. More pay, push for welfare means 1.2 billion Kenya shillings more annually and 6 billion Kenya shillings for 5 years. That story is on page 4 and 5. Like this, politicians have not even settled yet in Parliament. They've not even had their first session in Parliament, and they're already asking for more pay. All right, this is something we'll talk about just a little bit later. Let's just go through the headlines first. And children with cancer to get more chemo sessions. That story is on page 3. The main pictorial, Chebukati takes a break after grueling polls. IEBC chairperson Wafula Chebukati takes time off at the Mombasa Golf Club yesterday. Dry bore holds wet curiosity. That is an opinion piece by Okech Kend on page 16. Raila Ruto war shifts to parties, millions from government funds. That story is on page 6. Uhuru's name features in Kimwarero and Arol Dam's corruption case. That story is on page 9 on the Star. The Standard newspaper, CBK boss, shocking revelation. Central Bank of Kenya governor told MPs that a golden bag-like scheme was hatched by some rogue banks during the heated political season that led to the shilling's slump to historic lows. Though hesitant to name the culprits, the governor laid bare the difficulties the new government faces in managing the economy going forward. That story is on page 8, 19 and 22. Perhaps I'll just quote him there. I want to assure you that we have adequate foreign exchange. What was happening is that in the past 2 or 3 months, we had people who were trying to bring us back to golden bag. That is according to Patrick Njoroge, Central Bank of Kenya governor, and the 7.737 billion Kenya shillings foreign currency reserves held by the Central Bank of Kenya as of September 15th, up from 7.346 billion US dollars as of September 8th. Okay. Revealed the new dens for sex predators. That is on a special report on the Standard on page 12 and 13. 3.6 billion Kenya shillings for cheap fertilizer. That is on page 7. IG sued over corruption on highways. That is on page 20. It was about time. I don't know if he's the right person to sue, but corruption on the highways. So, someone is suing the Inspector General of Police. The story is on page 20. Is this the return of Nick Mwenda? That is on sports page on page 39. And Kenya on high alert over Ebola outbreak. Ministry of Health has heightened surveillance at the country's border crossing points after Ebola killed a 24-year-old man in Uganda. You'll find that on page 3. The Daily Nation, the main headline, how Raila lost, basking in the false promise of victory betrayed by lieutenants in his traditional bastions, suffering the curse of false incumbency, labelled as state project by William Ruto and running a disorganized agent system. Raila Amolo Odinga was flying blind on August 9th with devastating consequences. That story is on page 4, 5 and 6 on the Daily Nation. And then just up there, queries over 55 billion Kenya shillings spent in last days of Uhuru. Where did the money go? The Daily Nation is asking. Members of Parliament are raising questions regarding colossal amounts of money allocated to various government ministries and agencies days to the end of Uhuru term, at a time when the country faced a huge foreign debt and food and fuel subsidy crisis. You'll find that on the back page, on the pages 22, pages 2 and 3 on the Daily Nation. Subsidized fertilizer capped at 100 bags per farmer. The Ruto government will spend 3.5 billion Kenya shillings to subsidize the cost of 1.4 million 50 kilogram bags of fertilizer, but farmers will only be allowed to buy a maximum of 100 bags. The story is on the back page. And on drought, over 4 million in need of food aid as famine stalks nations with rains failing across the country. Experts warn that 4.3 million Kenyans spread across 10 counties will require food rations in October. But where is the money? That is the big question. The story is on page 12. JITAS as Uganda declares first Ebola death since 2019. At present, there is no licensed medication to prevent or treat the disease, though a range of experimental drugs are in development and thousands have been vaccinated in the DRC and neighboring countries. That story is on page 22. Now let's turn our attention now to some newspapers from across Africa and others from the UK. We start with the Daily Telegraph from the UK. Putin set to declare occupied land part of Russia. I think I was just watching the latest just a few minutes before I got here, and I think he had a national address. They thought he will declare occupied land part of Russia, but I think what he said was different from this headline. But he said, you know, if the US keep pushing him, then even they will use any means necessary to protect the integrity of Russia, even if it means using nuclear weapons or something like that. So things are not looking very good, especially for Putin. He's been losing ground in some of the places he had his army or soldiers had occupied in Ukraine. So anyway. The Guardian from the UK, Biden rejects Prime Minister's embrace of reignite tax policies. And then Newsday from Zimbabwe, 120,000 women die giving birth. Well, that is sad. Okay, we used to have that, but since the Linda Mama program where, you know, if you're seeking any maternity or any postnatal or any of those services, it is free in all public, you know, health facilities. So that in our country has gone a long way in ensuring the reduction of, you know, the death of, you know, mothers during childbirth or during that period of pregnancy. So 120,000 women dying giving birth, that is very alarming there in Zimbabwe, and hopefully they'll be able to address that. I'm assuming maybe a lot of them cannot access health facilities, or they're not health facilities, or they can't afford health facilities, because that usually was the reason why down here we used to experience that. But now, you know, the government of former president now, Uhuru Kenyatta, did something to address that. So hopefully this new government will do more to just address that and expand that, and perhaps, you know, work on the quality on the services delivered in these government institutions. Very well. The Daily News from Zimbabwe, police in notable Harare operation as Zimbabwe capital turns into a dirty and chaotic city. Okay. The Guardian from Nigeria, federal government to leave behind 60.9 trillion naira debt are the liabilities in 2023. The same way, you know, you know, we are dealing with a similar problem here. Anyway, The Nation from Nigeria, INEC clears Tinubu, Atiku, Obi, 15 others for 2023 poll. That is the Electoral Commission of Nigeria. The Daily Monitor from Uganda, Ebola outbreak, that is the main headline. And then the New Vision from Uganda as well, Makerere, Chambongo admission list out. And then the Citizen from Tanzania, winners and losers as government finally acts on levies, outcry, EAC chief defense oil pipeline project, demand for coal in Europe, a boom for Tanzania. That is what we have. And the Guardian, still from Tanzania, Treasury cuts levies on ATM bank transactions. And I think I have that on the latest news from across the continent. Those are just the headlines. So let's just get into the news quickly, and then we shall move on to our discussion this morning. I see Tawish has already joined there. So we start with Tanzania, and more than 100 members of a youth gang arrested in Tanzania are expected to appear in court to answer to criminal charges in the city of Dar es Salaam. The authorities are working towards containing criminal activities carried out by the Panya Swahili Forat road gang. The gang was, which has members aged between 14 and 30, has been in operation since 2016 and is widely known for using machetes to raid homes and carry out robberies. Jumanne Muliro, the Dar es Salaam regional police commander, said more than 300 police officers have been deployed to various locations of the city to arrest suspected gang members. Last week, police confirmed killing 6 people in connection with criminal activities in the city. And still staying with Tanzania, Tanzania has scrapped unpopular banking and mobile money transaction fees imposed last year amid public outcry. Finance Minister Mwigulu Nchemba told lawmakers the charges were abolished following a directive by President Samia Suluhu Hassan. The move affects charges for transactions from bank accounts to mobile money accounts, transactions within the same bank, and transactions from one bank to another. The charges will come into effect on 1st of October. The minister said the charges will greatly affect the government's revenue, but ordered state agencies to cut expenditures on snacks, seminars, and workshops. And then we go to Zimbabwe, and Senegal's President Macky Sall has called for a lifting of sanctions against Zimbabwe in his address to the 77th UN General Assembly in New York. The Senegalese leader and the current chairman of the African Union said measures against Zimbabwe were aggravating the suffering of the people. The US and the European Union maintain sanctions on Zimbabwe, citing a lack of progress in democratic and human rights reforms, as well as restrictions on press freedoms. The sanctions target both specific individuals and companies, including President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Zimbabwe's economy has faced a deep economic crisis over the past few years, with periods of hyperinflation, but there's little evidence to suggest that the sanctions are responsible. President Sall was the first African leader to address the General Assembly. He urged the Security Council to address conflicts in Africa in the same way it addressed other conflicts. It also called for reforms in the Council that would make it more inclusive and possibly grant Africa a permanent seat. Mr. Sall also called for Africa to be given a seat in the G20 group, which includes leaders of the world's 20 major economies. More African leaders are expected to address the UN General Assembly on Wednesday, on the second day of the high-level debate. Head over to Equatorial Guinea, and the death penalty has been abolished in Equatorial Guinea, according to a new criminal code signed by President Teodoro Obiang, state media has reported. The last execution in the country took place 8 years ago. Mr. Obiang's son, Vice President Teodoro Nguema Obiang Mangue, described the decision as historical and memorable, Reuters news agency quoted. The new penal code will be implemented after 90 days, and the move comes 3 years after President Obiang promised to abolish the death penalty. The acting UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Nada Af-Nashif, praised the new law. Back to Uganda, and a small group of placard-carrying protesters gathered outside the European Union offices in Uganda's capital, Kampala, to express a displeasure over what it calls over its calls to the country to end a strategic oil pipeline project with neighboring Tanzania. Last week, the EU Parliament passed a resolution warning of human rights abuses and social and environmental risk posed by the project. Rights groups say 100,000 people risk being displaced and have urged the contractors, France's Total Energies and the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, to pause the $10 billion project until they find an alternative route. The East African crude oil pipeline project will stretch 1,443 kilometers from Lake Albert in western Uganda to Tanzania port of Tanga on the Indian Ocean. The authorities in Tanzania and Uganda have criticized the EU's opposition to the project. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni said nothing would stop the project. Eritrean troops have launched a full-scale offensive in Ethiopia's Tigray region, as spokesperson for the Tigrayan rebel group TPLF has said. A U.S. envoy said the U.S. is aware of Eritrean troops crossing into Tigray and condemned it. The Eritrean and Ethiopian governments have not yet commented on the claims. If Eritrea's offensive against the rebels is confirmed, it will mark an escalation following the collapse of a 5-month truce last month. Conflict broke out in November 2020 following a massive fallout between Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the Tigrayan People Liberation Front, TPLF, which controls the region. Eritrea intervened on the side of Ethiopian military, but it reportedly withdrew most of its troops last year. On Tuesday, TPLF spokesperson Getachew Reda said heavy fighting was taking place in several areas along the Tigray-Eritrea border. Back to Uganda, and Uganda confirmed an outbreak of Ebola virus in Mubende district following the death of one patient. The confirmed case, a 24-year-old man, passed away on Monday. He lived in Mubende district, located 150 kilometers west of the capital Kampala. Speaking to the media, the permanent secretary for the Ugandan Ministry of Health, Dr. Atwine, gave further details, and he said that when he reported to the hospital, he had the symptoms suspected to be Ebola. It remains unknown how the victim became infected, but he was initially treated for other illness, including malaria, when he sought care in his hometown. It has been more than a decade since Uganda's last record of Sudan strain infection, the World Health Organization has said. Nigerian students on Monday protested the strike deadlock that has shut the country's public universities for 7 months, causing frustration for an estimated 2.5 million students. Defying armed security personnel in the commercial hub of Lagos, hundreds of students blocked a major road leading to the Murtala Mohammed International Airport, Nigeria's busiest airport. Some flights were disrupted. They marched with placards and chanted songs urging the Nigerian government to carry out the demands of public university lecturers who have been on strike since February to demand improved working conditions. And then we head over to Chad, and the head of the Chad's diplomacy announced his resignation on Monday, accusing the ruling military junta of relegating him to the role of an extra. The announcement comes in the middle of a laborious national reconciliation dialogue. Sharif Mohammed Zeni was the main negotiator for the government in the long and painful negotiations that have led to a peace agreement in Doha on 8th August with some 30 out of 50 rebel movements. This pact enabled some of the armed groups to be involved in the national, inclusive and sovereign dialogue, which opened a month ago in N'Djamena and is supposed to lead to free and democratic elections. Now that last part, I'm not sure if that would really happen, but let's just I'll be following that story. Move on to South Sudan, and the Chinese government has donated 63 vehicles, including buses, to the unified forces in logistical support for the implementation of the security arrangements. 3 weeks ago, the peace parties passed out more than 20,000 peace soldiers comprised of the various units, namely the police, National Security, Fire Brigade and the Wildlife, among others. At the weekend, more than 2,000 graduated from the Mundri training camp as part of the first phase of integrating and unifying the forces. Speaking at the state-owned TV SSBC Tuesday, the Defense Minister Anginal Tenyi said Friends of South Sudan have shied away from supporting the extended peace process except for China. Okay. But I thought the Troika also has continued to support that peace process. That will be US, France, and UK, I think. All right, let's move on to Tunisia. An 81-year-old opposition leader, Rashid Ghannouchi, appeared Tuesday before an anti-terror unit. After hours in the waiting Monday and postponement of his questioning, he was eventually questioned over an alleged involvement in sending jihadist military to Syria and Iraq. The supporters of the El Hada chief chanted freedom and slogans as they gathered in a show of solidarity. The party spokesperson denounced a willingness to ill-treat Ganuchi throughout the interrogation process. One of the deputies of the party, Ali, was also questioned and was held at the headquarters of the anti-terror until late Monday. In a statement released overnight, El Hadar denounced the interrogation as a flagrant violation of human rights, citing one of his lawyers. Reuters agency reported Lariyadh will appear before a judge on Wednesday, that is today. And I'll just quote what he said. "We are shocked. The file is completely empty and without any evidence." And another lawyer confirmed it to Reuters. So that is what we have. It's the latest news from across the continent of Africa. This morning, you are now up to date, and a very good morning to you. Samuel Tawish has joined us. Tawish, a very good morning to you.
Very good morning indeed to you, Miriam Ogutu. Good morning to all our viewers watching the program in Kenya, Africa, and the rest of the world. It's my great pleasure to join you this morning on this program. Good morning, Miriam.
All right, good morning. And I'm sure you are listening. We'll not be able to go through the whole of these news items before you get into some of the stories in the Kenyan newspapers. But a few stories that caught my attention this morning. So there were protests in Kampala, and because outside the European Union offices in Uganda's capital Kampala, to express displeasure over what it calls the EU. The EU wants to end a strategic oil pipeline project with neighboring Tanzania. There is a massive infrastructure that is being put forth as far as oil is concerned, and the EU is saying that EU Parliament passed a resolution warning of human rights abuses and the social and environmental risk posed by the project. And I think must be related to a story I've been watching, especially I think Al Jazeera and CNN. They've been doing a good job in highlighting. I think that's place. I think indigenous people there, the Maasai, a lot of them have been forced to move out, and the government is working on finding them alternative ways to settle them. But there has been a disagreement over that place. But why would EU's Parliament pass a resolution on something that Tanzania and Uganda should be able to work and find solutions for? Why do they
thank
find
you so much.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you for that question. And I think generally the question here will be probably it is the EU that is maybe sponsoring the activities or sponsoring this particular project, and that is why there could be so much interested or keen in seeing how it is going to be implemented, and if there are probably hurdles in line of implementing this particular project. I think maybe virtue of common sense will dictate that they have to maybe look into the alternative ways, or even see what kind of actions to take, maybe to pile pressure or make sure that by the end of the day this project is going to be undertaken. But again, I've seen the kind of what you've tried to allude to in terms of what is bringing a headache or a hurdle in terms of implementing this project, and the feeling by some people that probably they have been displaced from what they used to otherwise call home, and maybe there's not so much a proper remuneration, so much compensation in terms of how they are going to be relocated. I think that is a genuine concern that every well-meaning of course, stakeholders should be able to take into consideration, because again, in as much as these projects are viable projects, projects that are going to turn around, say, for example, the economy of these respective countries, or even improve the livelihood of the people, it is also important to consider that in the face of implementing this project, in the face of making sure that this project is going to come into fruition, that the normal livelihood and the way of life for the people that are affected are not going to be destroyed in one way or another. So I think they have to, it's kind of a delicate balance between of course, how this project is going to be undertaken, but at the same time making sure that we are not going to, say, for example, to victimize or to compromise the lives of the people who perhaps have been relying on this, maybe on the land that they are told to evacuate. Eventually, to allow this project really to come into fruition. So I think much as really EU is undertaking this project, I would want to imagine so that the ones maybe who are sponsoring this project, they should also be cognizant of that fact, that we do not want to see people just being evacuated or displaced from their homes for simple reason that they want to put up this project, but again without considering where these people are going to be relocated. I think these are the things that they can be able to sit down with the respective governments of Uganda and Tanzania and see what will be the best way or the best approach really to employ.
And maybe just a point of correction there, EU is not sponsoring this project. This is a project between Uganda and Tanzania, and they have contracted. France's Total Energies and the China National Offshore Oil are the ones who are working on this project. So the EU is just opposed to this project because they're saying, it's warning of human rights abuses and the social and environment risk posed by this project. So EU is not the sponsor of this. It is Total Energy from France and also the China National Offshore Oil Corporation. Probably it's the Chinese presence there that they don't like much because, these people sometimes they have to look out for their own interests. But some of the issues, like you have stated there, Tawish, are legitimate. If you have to move these indigenous people who occupy this land that you now need for this project, then it has to be done in a way that is dignified, in a way that they are compensated properly, because if that fails to happen, then we might have a repeat of what is happening in northern Mozambique, in the Cabo Delgado region. Remember that area that has had fighting intensify for a couple of years now is rich with mineral resources, and multinational international companies settled there, for oil and gas and these other explorations. And the indigenous people who occupy this land were never compensated, were removed and, taken where. So that, so when these other extremist groups came in, it was easier to recruit younger people who felt disfranchised by their own government. They didn't understand where we are or where we used to be is the richest place as far as this country is concerned, but again it's the poorest as far as social and other economic activities is concerned, because the multinational companies are benefiting at the expense of indigenous people. So if this is not handled properly, then it's easier for these young people to play into the hands of extremist groups who will come in and take advantage of their discontent with the government. So perhaps I can agree with what you're saying, Samuel Tawish. This has to be done well. But where I'm finding a problem is why EU Parliament would pass this resolution. If they had this concern, they will just put it forth, and then it should be left between Uganda and Tanzania to decide and to see how can we best implement this project, but at the same time find it's necessary to sanction us, so rather to perfect what is happening in this continent. I think that is where I'm finding issues on, Tawish.
Much appreciations, Miriam, for that clarification. But be that as it may, Miriam, I think much of our emphasis and stress should be about the human rights abuses, even in the face of the implementation of this project. I think that is where the concentration should be, that in as much as we want to see this project really being undertaken and it being a success, it should also not be done at the detriment of the livelihood of the people who rely on those reserves on that part of land. Because again, by the end of the day, the normal livelihood of the people must really continue. But Miriam, also, suffice to mention, there are people who have always known it, how to go about this in terms of people who already foretell and know that perhaps this particular road reserve or this particular parcel of land is already designated for a particular project. And you'll realize that there are people who get to know this early in advance, because there are physical studies that are being undertaken before we get to the level of implementing these projects anywhere in the world. I don't think there's anybody who will just wake up one day and begin putting up a project without really carrying out a rigorous kind of physical outlook of the entire project and how it's going to to affect the locals or the people who live within that particular environment. So I think there are people who have always known how to even milk from government or even milk out of this project. And more so, it's not ordinary people, it's the elites who use now the ordinary wananchi really for their own benefit. I do not want to pass judgment and have a foregone conclusion that perhaps this is the case with what we are trying to deal with at the moment. But again, Miriam, also, if I should just trigger your memory a bit, the EU cannot wake up one day and just begin processes of or having sanctions on Uganda, on Tanzania, or any nations without necessarily a trigger coming from the affected countries. It could be maybe human rights crusaders, or somebody has just gone to petition the EU in terms of maybe the question of human rights abuses or the supposed human rights abuses if this project is going to be undertaken. So it is something, there could be some information that probably we could be missing, or something that is being hidden from us that we are not very sure about. Because again, I'm not very sure that EU can wake up one day without them being an interested party, and secondly, without a trigger in terms of anyone really taking their a petition maybe to stop this project or to try and...
The current chairperson of the African Union has called for lifting of sanctions against Zimbabwe in his address to the 77th UN General Assembly in New York. The leader said the measures against Zimbabwe were aggravating the suffering of the people, and then I'm just looking for another matter that he addressed when he's the first African president who spoke, and because he's the AU chairperson currently. So all right, so okay, he said Zimbabwe's economy has faced deep economic crisis over the past few years, with periods of hyperinflation, but there's a little evidence to suggest that the sanctions are probably responsible for that. And he urged the Security Council to address conflicts in Africa in the same way. This is the part I really wanted us to look at. He said the Security Council must now address conflicts in Africa in the same way it addressed other conflicts. And also he called for reforms in the council that will make it more inclusive and possibly grant Africa a permanent seat. In a nutshell, everything that we talked about here yesterday, remember we had that lengthy show and we're looking at some of these issues. So, so I think the feeling is mutual across Africa. It is about time that perhaps Africa was given a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, but also why are the conflicts in Africa not given the same priority? Because the conflict that is ongoing right now in Ethiopia started way before the Russia-Ukraine, conflict. But that was never received that international attention. Every now and then, US would say something, or UK or whatever, but it was never, given that much priority. So the African Union chairperson, Senegal's President Macky Sall, is saying, hey, even us here, we matter, and on top of that, we need a seat at the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member.
Miriam, these are very legitimate concerns being raised by Macky Sall, and I think he just represents the many views of most African people, if not African leaders, because again, there are so many people who hold an almost similar view, albeit in silence. I think it is time we really need to confront this issue of sanctions, because again, more often than not, it has come to haunt, or really it has worked to the detriment of the ordinary Mwananchi, other than even the targeted elites. And I think the argument has all along been, how come that we cannot have targeted sanctions? Say, for example, if it's about an institution, if it's about an individual, if it's about a leadership or a government, or even a ministry or a department in government that is really not doing the right thing. Why would we have a blanket sanction to a nation or to a country or even to a people when we can have a targeted sanction. I think that is very, very important. But that is not to generally say that sanctions have not worked in the past, really in terms of trying to even coerce or make people to do the right thing in terms of policy making, in terms of doing the right thing. We've seen the terrorism conflict in the whole world. We've seen the kind of course, lack of democracy in most countries today. We've seen the suppression of human rights in most parts of the world today, and sanctions have, to a large extent, really played a critical role in trying to bring things into the right direction. And I think, Miriam, it is not time for us really to have a blanket condemnation on sanctions generally. But again, that is not to say that if there are sanctions that are really not working in the best interest of the larger population or the larger group of people in a nation or even in a continent, that is something that we must also speak against. And I think in this particular case, as is for Zimbabwe, I mean, Zimbabwe has been through a lot in terms of its leadership problem, in terms of its economic woes, and there's so many myriad of challenges that Zimbabwe has been going through, and also the issue of sanctions, especially during the time of the late President Robert Mugabe. And I think when Zimbabwe is now working very hard to come out of the woods, when it's working very hard to try and reclaim its position, it's not just that time really to try as much to pull back Zimbabwe again. It's not time to hold back the foot of Zimbabwe. It is time to allow them really to get back to the right footing. It's time to support them in terms of the kind of initiatives they're putting in place to revive the economy. And so when Macky Sall comes and submits such kind of legitimate concern and views, I think it is something that should not just be swept under the carpet. It's not a concern that should just be overlooked, but should be taken seriously and critically so, given the attention that it deserves. Away from that, Miriam, I think the question of the African nations, one or two, or the expansion of the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council membership is a discussion that we have had even yesterday, and we have continued to have it. And I think these are some of the things even during the UNGA summit that we are having in the course of this week and probably next week. We want to see really this concern being given a formal attention. I mean, from 1990s or thereabout, I mean, when there was agitation from mostly the African nations, one, to have a reform in the UN Security Council, and secondly, even to have an expansion of the membership, because there's a genuine feeling that we are not well represented as African people, when the high percentage of issues that are being addressed at the UN Security Council are more of the African issues, really touching on the African affairs. 70% of the cases being tackled at the UN Security Council really emanate from the African continent. So it beats logic why we cannot have a single membership in terms of permanent membership coming from the African continent. Out of the 5 permanent membership of the UN Security Council, we have 3 actually coming from Europe, and Africa is not even represented. The non-permanent membership, which has a 2-year rotational basis, also has about 10 memberships. So I think it's about the general reform at the UN Security Council that the African leaders and people are pursuing, and must be taken seriously and must be given the attention that it deserves. Other than that, Miriam, I think the doctrine and the tenets with which actually the UN Security Council was formed will becoming irrelevant if at all some of these critical issues are not going to be addressed, because again they have to listen onto the issues of the members and see how they're going to implement or even take into action some of these views and concerns that they continue to raise time and again. Miriam, I submit.
All right, very well. And I don't know, when Mnangagwa was elected, when he took over from Robert Mugabe, of course, after that coup, and then, they went into an election and he was elected back, perhaps people thought that maybe things will change as far as how Zimbabwe relates diplomatically and otherwise with other countries, especially this ones that sanctioned, Zimbabwe, or rather things will change, period. But things have not gotten better. And and the Western world, of course, has not opened up. Zimbabwe cannot really get the loans and the grants it needs to help in rebooting that economy that it has been on his knees for a very long time now. Do you feel sometimes as though they're punishing or they continue to uphold these sanctions, because you can't talk to us about the reason why these sanctions continue, because these are the reasons they give, is because the current, leadership has a bad record as far as human rights abuses is concerned, as far as governance is concerned, as far as, what do you call it? Democracy, is concerned, because usually that is the yardstick they use to decide, okay, do you want to associate with you or not? Because if that is the case, then a person like Emmanuel Macron should not have gone to a country like Cameroon, because we know things there are worse. And we've seen other countries, country like Egypt under President Al-Sisi had literally a constitutional coup where a forced referendum happened to help him extend his stay there as the president in Egypt and other countries, but they still continue to have a diplomatic tie with this country. So it's interesting to see how they pick and choose which country they will address as far as the good governance, the human rights abuses, and democratic practices are concerned. Here in the continent, it is a complete, I think, doublespeak on their part. So is it because they're punishing President Mnangagwa because of his close association? Remember, he worked with the late President Mugabe in his government for a long time before they parted ways. Is it still a vendetta over that, or what do you think is going on between Zimbabwe and these countries out there?
Quite frankly, Miriam, I don't think it is. It's actually within my purview even to try and censure which kind of nations that the international community or the respective institutions that you have alluded to would want to associate with, or even to talk to, or to do business, or to enhance their foreign policy with. But my major concern will be why the targets. Why is Zimbabwe being targeted and negatively so? I think this is where I'm actually stressing my discussion. And looking onto Zimbabwe and where it's come from, of course, there's been that argument about the suppression of the human rights and the issue suppression of the voice of dissent in Zimbabwe, especially during the reign of one President Robert Mugabe, now the late. And it was the hope of many that with the coming in of the new administration being led by one President Emerson Mnangagwa, that we are probably going to have a paradigm shift. You are going to have a new leadership in terms of how things are going to be done in Zimbabwe. But to many and to many observers and critics, still it remains as much as it were in the past. Albeit with some minimal changes. And I think the minimal changes that President Mnangagwa has been undertaking have not been sufficient enough really to trigger any kind of friendly policy coming from the foreign or the Western power countries. So I think it is time for Zimbabwe really to go back to the drawing board and ask themselves what is it that they should do right, that they're doing wrong, so that they can be able to renew their ties, to be able to reignite and refresh. Of course, the policy relationship between, of course, Zimbabwe and the Western power countries, because again, the people who are going to suffer most are the ordinary people in Zimbabwe, and not President Mnangagwa per se. Because again, as for him, he has all the security, he has everything he will have at his disposal. He can be able to fly out of the country. He can be able to relocate his family when things become tough in Zimbabwe. Even when the economy is very tough as it is today, President Mnangagwa and even his close allies, I bet will not sleep hungry. And so it is also not in the best interest of the people of Zimbabwe really to see the sanctions and the kind of hard kind of conditions being imposed on Zimbabwe just for them to be able to come back on track. But again, it is also important to remind the leadership of President Mnangagwa that they should know what really happened with the regime of President Mugabe, the kind of disaffection that the majority of the people of Zimbabwe really had developed in the presidency of President Robert Mugabe. and even how he came into power himself, President Emerson Mnangagwa. It was out of that disaffection, and that really led him even to become president, and at the ousting of the late President Robert Mugabe. So it is important for him not to repeat the same mistakes, because again, they usually say history has a tradition of repeating itself. And so if he doesn't do things right, then his fate is as good as done. He may as well find himself also being ousted from office, the same way his predecessor was actually removed from office. Those are not the kind of scenarios we want to see. We want the people of Zimbabwe really to have an ample time for them to sit down and have that peace, to concentrate, to rebuild the economy. That is the most important thing for us as African people. And we will not want to see these sanctions really impede on the motivation, on the spirit and the hopes of the people of Zimbabwe really to rebuild their nation. But as for the sanction, I think just like President Sall really has a petition and censured the international community, it is time these sanctions really have to be reviewed. What kind of impact has it had ever since they were imposed on Zimbabwe? Have they been able to achieve anything out of it? And if anything, really, has it been more of a positive achievement? Have we made any positive strides in terms of these sanctions? It is also important for us sometimes to do really an audit of these sanctions, because we cannot just have sanctions being imposed on a country or on a nation or on a people, and for them just to be there forever without really doing an audit of what has been the impact and what new approach or new thing we can be able to do really to have things back on track. Miriam, I submit.
Very well, thank you so much. And if we're looking at suppression of dissenting voices there, I think Uganda, our neighbor here, is not doing very well in that. Rwanda, but they're still members of Commonwealth. Matter of fact, Rwanda was just admitted the other day. And so, yeah, I think it's about time they review, and I'm happy that the AU chairperson brought this to the attention of the world, and also just castigating the world leadership there for neglecting some of the conflicts that have been in this continent, and they don't treat it the same way perhaps they have treated the conflicts, let's say that one in Ukraine and others. They don't get the much attention. But I don't know if that is the work of the United Nations. Fine, to some extent, yeah, but I think African Union is really failing us. So if we go to the United Nations General Assembly there and complain that the conflicts in Africa are not being addressed in the same way other conflicts are being addressed, while our leading institution here, African Union, is not doing much in itself with whatever it has in its own capacity to try to address these conflicts. For instance, I've not seen the AU meeting and talk about the issues in Ethiopia. I've not seen the AU meeting of late and discuss the ongoing conflict in Libya, the ongoing conflict in Central African Republic, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and others. So we don't want to do the job. Instead, we want somebody else to come in and help us out. So I think they should start addressing and then ask for help where necessary. That is just my personal opinion, but it is good that he recognizes some of these things in the continent, and he tried to speak out. And all right, we'll just move on to something that caught my attention from the Kenya's newspapers. The Star newspaper. President William Ruto is treading a fine line as pressure mounts from MPs and MCAs for reinstatement of their sitting allowances and other perks abolished as redundant by the Salaries Agency in their campaigns. All said fixing the economy and lowering the cost of living for Kenyans should be the next president's top priority. The president could be faced with the problem of freeing billions demanded by lawmakers who will drive his agenda or not, following serious shortfalls in confronting the new administration. DP Rigathi Gachagua told Kenyans on Inauguration Day the economy was in tatters and coffers were empty and they should be patient while President Ruto fixes the problems. On Wednesday, the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, a constitutional body, will hold an induction for all lawmakers to explain how it works and the principles and documents it uses to establish equitable distribution of income. Kenya Kwanza leaders acknowledged the cash flow challenges. Recently, Nandi Senator Samson Cherargei deplored that the tank was almost empty. So in a nutshell, MPs and the MCAs now want more money. They're not even settled. They now want more money. They want all their allowances to be returned and all the other perks that they were enjoying. Samuel Darwish, the Kenyan population must feel very cheated right now. I'm on Mizoya.
Miriam, indeed, it's a very interesting discussion and topic at this time, especially when the Kenyan populace are really facing hard times economically and also struggling just to put a meal on the table. And Miriam, I think even hardly before the elected lawmakers begin their duty formally, they've already began really asking about the allowances, asking about their salary increment, even before they even earn the maiden pay from from the job that they have been employed by the Kenyan people. In itself is really a great pity. It's a big slap on the face of the many struggling Kenyans during this very hard economic time, Miriam. And also, it leaves one wondering. I've been very keen, really watching and sometimes listening and reading the kind of retreats and the kind of course, the induction workshops that these lawmakers have been having ever since they were elected or sworn into office. And you can hardly hear anyone really, out of the many elected leaders, really hardly anyone speak about what this nation should do in terms of lowering the cost of living for the ordinary mwananchi. In terms of, say, for example, one of the serious bills that maybe any lawmaker or collectively as legislators that they'll be sponsoring on the floor of the House to make sure that the cost of living comes down. I haven't heard from our legislators. So it is something that is funny, it's something that is interesting. But again, I'm not treated to a surprise because this has always been the norm. This has been the tradition with our elected leaders. It has always been about them, and they will do anything when it comes to their perks, when it comes to their salaries, when it comes to their mileage allowance, sitting allowances, when it comes to every other thing that matters to them. You'll see them really troop even to the floor of the House or troop even to this induction workshop to the last man and woman. But when it comes to the issue of, say, for example, addressing the cost of living, assuming today there was a bill about the value-added tax, VAT, or something to try and reduce the cost of living, you will hardly see even a quarter of lawmakers really present in that particular meeting or summit or even on the floor of the House. It's a great pity, and it really begs a lot of questions as to why we are electing these leaders in the first place. Yes, we know it's about representation, it's about legislation, it's about oversight. But I think there's one particular, of course, role that most lawmakers have really reneged on in terms of the representation, in terms of what is it that they are doing for the people, the interests of the people. Are they really advocating the interests of the people as it should, or as it were? Because that is not what we are seeing with our legislators. It is also a great pity for one, the immediate former senator for Bungoma and the now Speaker of the National Assembly. I was listening to him when I was addressing the members of the National Assembly at a hotel in Nairobi, and I was really amused. I could not really understand that this is the Speaker of the National Assembly speaking, but only referring everything to do with the perks for the legislators, the issue to do with their privileges, the issue to do with their allowances, the issue to do with how they are going to increase their salary, the issue to do with their mileage allowance and every other thing, the entertainment, and maybe even get more extra coins to be able to cater for the so many extra roles that they undertake in their constituencies in terms of catering for the hospital bills, for the funerals, and so many other things, including school fees for those who cannot afford. So, Miriam, I also expected that perhaps the Speaker of the National Assembly will confront the lawmakers, will confront the and legislators into understanding exactly that their role is more of representing and legislating bills that really matter to the people, especially at this critical moment when the Kenyan people are facing a very hard economic time. So it's a great pity. I really want to hope against all odds that once this induction workshop is done, once they get now back to once they get back to work, that they'll be able to get back to their senses and really get to understand why they were elected in the first place. It's about the ordinary people. We're really suffering out here. I mean, the cost of living is high. We can hardly afford food. I mean, taking kids to school is a big issue because of the school fees. I mean, generally things are not that very soft on the part of the ordinary mwananchi, and it's time our legislators really gave a priority and consideration to these issues that really matter to us as the ordinary people, especially those of us who gave them that job to represent and be able to legislate on our behalf. Miriam, I submit.
All right, thank you so much. And just a quick one, and in case you're wondering what these members of parliament already have with them, the ordinary member of parliament salary is at 710,000 Kenya shillings. The speaker's salary is 1.16 million Kenya shillings. The deputy speaker is 928 million Kenya shillings. Leader of majority's salary is 768,000 Kenya shillings. The committee seating allowances chairperson is 240,000 Kenya shillings. The vice chairperson is 192,000 Kenya shillings, and the members in those committees gets 120,000 Kenya shillings. Vehicle reimbursement, 7.5 million Kenya shillings, they get that. Car maintenance, 356,525 Kenya shillings. Mileage allowance up to 353,778 Kenya shillings. Special duty allowance for leaders, 150,000 Kenya shillings. Medical cover inpatient, they have each 10 million Kenya shillings. Outpatient, 300,000 Kenya shillings. Maternity, 150,000 Kenya shillings. Mortgage, they're given up to 35 million Kenya shillings. Car loan, 8 million Kenya shillings. Airtime, 15,000. And the audacity of it all, that is not enough. They still want more. Okay. That marks the end of our show this morning. Samuel Tawish, thank you so much for your time. We were giving way for another conversation, and let me just remind us what we shall be looking at this morning. In a couple of minutes, we shall be looking at the International Day for Peace, What Way Africa. So that will be our next conversation. Thank you so much. This has been Good Morning Africa. My name is Miriam Ogutu. Good morning.